I am, I'm not interested. My interest, the relationship I have between you and me is a story. And so you can't convince me that you've been sitting here since yesterday, listening or looking like you are listening, and you are not doing anything. Violet is looking at me there violently, but the truth of the matter is that I don't want any relationship with you. And the relationship that I have with all of you is because of a story. So like it, don't like it, we must do. You can't come from Addis Ababa and then you go back without doing a story. Certainly, Sierra Leone is too far. Okay, veterans have already done stories and posted. Others are still struggling for their first story. Make that breakthrough through your Twitter. Make that breakthrough through your Facebook. Okay, LinkedIn, posting something, a nice photo. There. TikTok is the TikTok thing, and it is the thing that is talking now. So let's make use of all this. Richard, I'm sorry about my preaching.
No, it's good.
Yeah.
It's not a preaching, it's a warning almost. Okay, good afternoon and welcome back. As usual, afternoon is after the noon and the lunch and all. Oh. Okay, I think you need not to show it. Okay. Yeah. Okay, we have lots of technical problems, compatibility. Nevertheless, the issues remain relevant. And as Agan said, the story matters. And this session is all about, again, as we have been speaking about, the most challenging aspects of development. And this session will be talking about the very big challenge of how to manage our waste. We exist, we are alive, and we generate waste. We consume more or less, we generate waste. But it's turning out to be the biggest challenge. In fact, if you look at it, it's the biggest living challenge. Just like the air pollution, this is also one aspect that's day to day, but accumulate and kills also. So for this session, we have two speakers. So Atin Biswas, who is a director and in charge of Center for Science and Environment's Waste Management and Circularity Program, which is a pan-world program that actually tracks the waste management, the creations, the challenges, and Siddharth, who tracks the plastic treaty. As we all know that we are under the process of getting a treaty on abolishing plastic. And very soon we expect that global meeting. It's called the INC2. So it's a story which has an urgency. So let me start with 2018. The landfill in Lagos caught fire. And as you know, the landfill in Lagos, Nigeria, is the biggest one in the world, in fact. And it caught fire. So we were reporting this story, and there are habitations around that landfills. So our reporter, who is not here, but he just asked a small child. He asked a child, what do you feel about this? What is this that's catching fire and it's burning? And her reply was, it is a mountain. And then he asked her, again, taking the conversation, so from where did this mountain come from? And her answer was natural. Means she must have spoken and answered it with all innocence, with all the textbook knowledge or whatever it is. That we started the story with that, natural. It's a landfill, basically a mountain of garbage, mountain of waste, which is a superlative of being the largest in the world, which a new generation sees as natural. And it's not just Nigeria. If you go to Delhi, I think you will never have a sight of the world's oldest mountain range, Aravalli, from anywhere. But you will definitely get to see the landfill. With every passing day, it's adding some height into it. Now we are clearing that. And across the world also, if you look at it, the cityscapes, we have landfills. So it brings to the questions about the waste. Now, how much we generate, how we manage, how we treat. We now, in fact, talk in terms of waste as a very critical part of the circular economy, where they say that waste is not waste, it's wealth. And if you come to Africa, why it should be a major issue? As the State of Africa's Environment Report will tell you, Africa's per capita waste generation is not even half of the world per capita. But still, it's a challenge. And why is that? Currently, Africa is the least urbanized continent in the world. 44% people reside in urban areas. But the story will change from 2035. And that's not, it's hardly 11, 12 years away. From here, what would happen? More people in Africa will stay in urban areas, or the urban population will be higher than the rural areas. And as I told you, the Africa's waste generation is the least among the continents, much lower than the developed economies. But by the end of this century, it will be 11 million ton per day from today's 500,000 ton. Just look at. No, we have lots of challenges. And we thought the waste is. So just look at the kind of increase. So Africa is also becoming very fast the continent where the waste generation will be the fastest among all the continents. And within Africa, the sub-Saharan Africa will have the most share of the waste generated. Even now also it's so. 65% of municipal solid waste generation in 2021 to around 80% by 2030. So sub-Saharan Africa will have the largest chunk of the waste generated in the continent. And it will be up to actually 80% of the total waste generated in Africa by 2030. And if Africa will account for the largest chunk of waste generated in the world, so the world's waste challenge is also an African challenge. If Africa doesn't manage, doesn't treat, doesn't recycle, and doesn't actually bring the waste into its circular economy things, the world is going to fail severely. And this is one of the key messages of the SOE Africa. So what happened? Waste collection is one of the lowest in the world, according to the World Bank. So one is the generation that's picking up, but waste management, the two critical parts is that, collect it, segregate it, manage it, treat it, recycle it, and, you salvage your resources out of that. But if you look at the collection, so it's the most critical step of it. It's the lowest in the world. And World Bank finds that just 60% of the waste generated are just disposed of. Remember, it's not managed. Disposed of means just throwing out. That explains contains, the landfills that we just spoke about. In sub-Saharan Africa, only 55% of waste is collected. And the result, if you look at it, 19 of the world's 50 biggest landfills you will find in the sub-Saharan Africa, despite the fact that Africa has the least per capita waste generation, even though it's rising. And there is another study from the University of Lagos. And I mentioned you the first incident from Lagos, the largest one. 90% of the landfill sites in 13 countries, that African countries were found to be just disposal grounds. It means there is no facility or lack of management. And
sorry, Richard, can you repeat that again? Basic 90%.
Yeah, it's a study from the University of Lagos that studied actually 13 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and it found that 90% of the landfill sites in these 13 countries are just disposal grounds. There is nothing called managing the waste. Basically, waste are being just dumped there. And it's it's considered to be one of the first study of Pan-Africa on the West. That was from the World Bank. Yeah, I'll share the PPT also, which you'll find all the things, all the sources. So this report brings out, based on many studies, many observations, what are the flaws? And sometimes many reports call it the fundamental flaws also in waste management. So ideally, waste should be collected, segregated, treated, not leaving chance for contamination, and also to be reused. That's why it's called the waste is also wealth. And that's where actually you bring in your circular economy and the circular model of recycling, reusing, and treating the rest safely. And in Africa, and again, particularly the sub-Saharan Africa, because that accounts for the largest chunk of waste generation, its waste are mostly biodegradable waste. Almost 57% of the waste are biodegradable organic material. Those are found in the waste actually dumped. Share of recyclables like plastic and glass is actually very less. And if you compare it to Asian countries also, and it's turning out to be very less. You can argue that it's the least. So 10 to 20% plastics are actually consist of the waste that dumped in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's very less actually if you compare to any other continent, any other country also. Only 55% of waste is collected. And that's another part that Atin will also bring into the insight into it. It means more than half of the waste are not collected. And there is a wide variance among cities on this, how much of waste is collected. Just to give you one data point, it's 24 out of 46 cities have reported below this 55% waste collection rate. And there are cities which have, in fact, 20% waste are being collected. So the average is 55. But if you look at it, there's wide variance because many cities claim up to 90% also waste collections. Lagos is one of them actually, which claims that it's 90%. Now the question comes, those collected, whether those waste are managed or not. So if you all the data that have been quoted and analyzed in this report, if you send, one United Nations estimate stands out. It says that only 19% of waste collected is actually managed. And what is the global average? 55% of waste is actually managed. That's the average for the world. And if you compare it to the African continent, it's just 19%. And remember, waste management is not just a typical sanitation or hygiene issue. It's a very much development issue. In fact, many of our sustainable development goals are linked to how safely you manage your waste. So there are examples, there are concerns, and as we all know, it's currently what we say that the waste is not waste, it's a wealth. And for Africa, that's more relevant. Going by the analysis in the report, SOE Africa, 90% of municipal solid waste in Africa is recyclable. It means can be used. And that's what the wealth is all about from waste. But only 10% is currently recycled. And they say that it's a multi-billion-dollar business. It's worth multi-billion-dollar, and there are estimates which put it sometimes at the continent-wide. Sometimes the highest rate of the wealth that can be generated, it's put at around $90 billion. And what we actually wasted now. That's the idealistic estimate of value you can take. And but Africa has a continental target. It calls the Agenda 2063. That is Africa's main development own program. Under this Agenda 2063, the continent is supposed to actually recycle at least 50% of its waste by 2030. That means in the next 7 years. And as I told you, means its waste is again turning out to be, and as you have been speaking, every development challenge or environmental challenge has, linked to our overall development. And in this case also, there are 5 sustainable development goals. Those will not be met if we don't manage our waste safely. And in 2022, the waste management is becoming a big issue in the continent, warranting a continent-wide agreement. So if you come to this Africa Ministerial Conference on Environment that happened in 2022, that was the first time they took a pledge, accepted a target that burning of waste will be free by 2030. And if you look at it, that has ramifications for your air pollution and the health. And that gives you a snapshot of the state of waste in the continent. While setting this and giving you this brief introductions, may I request now Atin Biswas, I have introduced him to you, so he can take us through, and after Atin, Siddharth. And after these 2 speakers, we'll again have our interactions, the questions and answers. So Atin, may I request now? It's your.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard, for the wonderful context. In fact, you made my job a lot easier now.
Atin, we cannot hear you.
I can hear you loud and clear, Richard. I don't know. Everything is fine at my end. Am I audible now?
Atin, just hold on. We are not able to hear you till we fix it.
Okay.
Atin, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
I just sent him.
Yeah, There's a problem at their end, I guess.
Oh.
Am I audible, Sukanya? Can you confirm? Because Siddharth says he can hear me loud and clear.
Siddharth, can you hear us?
Yes, Richard, I can hear you. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
No, Siddharth is not able to.
Atin, can you hear me?
Thanks.
Yes, I can hear you, Sid, loud and clear.
So, okay, Atin, sorry. So here is Atin Biswas. I have introduced him, and he tracks the waste management, and he also tracks the waste situation in Africa with all the details. So Atin, over to you. You have 15
Am I
minutes.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so Richard, thank you so much for setting the context. In fact, you almost made my job half done. So I'll just quickly share my screen, and I'll try to be as brief as possible because I will also have to bring in Siddharth for a very important discussions on the plastic and what is happening around the plastic waste management across the world, including the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to arrive at a legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution globally. So this is basically a cartoon which basically explains how these days we are managing our waste. It's not only relevant for Africa, rather it is relevant for the whole world. So this cartoon basically explains that a cart which is full of tires, which should have been used to kind of move the cart effortlessly without requiring much resources. So one person pulling, two persons pushing. So it's basically, if I summarize this cartoon for all the colleagues in Nairobi, it's basically misplaced resource. That is how we basically interpret the current context of waste management across the world. This is something that Richard has already touched based. So if you look at the pace at which waste management is increasing in sub-Saharan Africa, so we are basically looking at 300% increase compared to the current rate of generation in next 20, 30 years maybe. And all the data points are already there in SOE, so I'm not going to repeat it. So basically the average rate of collection it stands between 30 to 55%. 55% is on the higher side. And let me also reiterate that the rate of collection is way higher in areas predominantly populated by the affluent class compared to the settlements where relatively underprivileged, poor or informal sector are basically residing. And like Richard also mentioned, the current rate of waste management is only 19%. This is already discussed by Richard that it's not very alarmingly high, the per capita rate of waste generation in sub-Saharan Africa, but the quantity collected versus quantity dumped is where the main problem is. Richard already mentioned that according to the estimation. So let me just also make a clear point here that most of this data that I'm sharing with you are basically taken from the United Nations report or the World Bank report, just because there is hardly any data available in the sub-Saharan Africa. There has been some studies done in small catchment areas, which eventually has got extrapolated, and that is how we have been arrived at some statistical models to talk about what is the rate of generation, how much we are being able to collect, what is the amount that we are dumping, what is the amount that we are processing, etc. So all these numbers are nothing but mere estimation because we barely have data available with any of the states in the sub-Saharan Africa, which basically would have helped us to kind of talk about these numbers with a lot more confidence. Richard has already mentioned, so this is basically a composition of the sub-Saharan waste, as you can see that about 57% or close to 60% of this waste is biodegradable in nature, or if I say in a layman's language, these are food waste mostly, right? And this is where the most of the problems are. Now, majority of the food waste are actually ending up in the dump sites. It is releasing, it is decomposing fast. It is releasing methane, which is very potent greenhouse gas. It is releasing very toxic leachate. It is getting mixed with all the other types of waste. And those poisons are eventually leaching into our ground, killing the soil health, killing the water, and the GHGs eventually polluting the air as well. And since the event is happening in Kenya, let me just also take the opportunity to present some of the numbers. These numbers are already there in our report that we released last year, the state of waste management in Africa, which basically captures the solid waste ecosystem in 9 African nations in the sub-Saharan region. So again, the scenario that you can see in Kenya, I'm not going to read out the numbers just for paucity of time. So the collection efficiency is again where we see a big reason to worry about. And then even in Kenya, there is no specific number available to kind of talk about the quantity or the percentage which is getting recycled or processed or recover. And the most common forms of disposal, as Richard mentioned in his opening remark, is dumping, burning, and landfilling. If you look at the bottom left of the table, so we have the latest data till 2014, and if there is any further development, something that we may not be aware of, but I'm happy to incorporate them going forward. I'll talk about it later in the later part of my presentation. So Kenya's out of the national population of about 44.9 million, about 73% of Kenya lives in the rural area, where though the urban population is increasing very, very rapidly. And of this 5,600 tons per day of waste generation, what we have learned from the available data and literature, that most of this waste basically have been estimated to be generated from the urban space, right? So Kenya is having 5 major cities called Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, Nakuru, and Eldoret. So these 5,600 tons are mostly coming from these 5 cities, and from the rural space, there is hardly any data available, even for extrapolation or some statistical calculation. Again, if we look at the Kenya waste composition pie chart, it's not very different from the overall sub-Saharan Africa. If I talk in terms of the component, again, the collection revolves between 28 to 58%. But the collection rate is relatively higher in the major cities that I have just mentioned in the previous slide. In terms of treatment and recycling, there is hardly any formalized system in place. Whatever recovery and recyclability is happening in Kenya, like the other sub-Saharan countries, are all contributed by the informal sector, who are yet to find a space in the policy ecosystem in the African nations. And in terms of the treatment and recycling, the onus was with the private organization, and it didn't really work so far in any of the African nations that we had the opportunity to kind of collaborate with, just because the waste was collected from source in a mixed form. There was hardly any separation happening. Dump site, Richard has already spoken about that 19 of the 50 largest dump sites are from Africa. In Kenya, there is the Dandora dump site. In Nairobi, there is Kachok in Kisumu, which are operational for more than 40 years. These dump sites have already exhausted their capacity, but we are continuing to dump, and they are continuing to be a major source of pollution. Now, let me just quickly talk about the limiting factors that basically need to be addressed very, very urgently if we need to improve the waste ecosystem in the sub-Saharan region. We need to understand that there has been a transition globally, like early 80s or early 90s or early 2000s. The focus was mostly on disposal, that the cities should look cleaner, regardless of where the waste was ending up, right? It was, say, from early 2000, from late 2000 or maybe at the beginning of 2010 or 2012, the whole world started to realize the menace that we were creating, the problems that we are creating for ourselves. And then we started talking about circular economy, waste to wealth, how we can develop a business model around waste ecosystem. So when we introspected the policies that basically are governing the waste management ecosystem in the African region, if I look at the policies from three different tiers, so there are policies for national government, there are policies for regional government, and then there are policies for the local government. The policies are not specific, and even if they are specific, the mandate or the enforcement at the bottom of the administration has been very, very weak. There has been absence of synergy or limited synergies between the national, regional, and the local government. And like I mentioned already, there is very strong absence of credible data, which restricts us to do in-depth analysis or understand the problems at greater depth. There is hardly any clear mandate for source separation, or there is any real effort going into source separation, which is resulting in poor rate of processing and treatment, which stands around 19% in the sub-Saharan region. The collection and transportation also have been spoken about. There is very nominal investment happening in the processing and treatment, and it is further coupled with the ever-increasing plastic pollution and marine litter. Now, plastic pollution and marine litter is something that we know that there's a concerted effort being led by the United Nations Environment Program under United Nations Environment Assembly, and it is your cities, it is Kenya, which is going to host the third Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee between 13th and 19th November, where almost 190 member states are going to be there in Nairobi to deliberate and arrive at a legally binding treaty to manage our plastic problem. Unscientific disposal, waste burning, already discussed. And basically, this is where we are losing the battle, right? If I talk about, we attempted to understand what is the current revenue that was being generated from waste management. We were unable to arrive at any specific conclusion to kind of give a forecast that if I was spending $100 for waste management, what was basically the revenue that I could generate from that expenditure. And there was hardly any example that we could come across in the sub-Saharan Africa where there was a budget allocation on sanitation or to reinforce waste management, because it is basically a public good. Now, let me just pause here for some time because I just want to loop in my senior colleague, Mr. Siddharth Singh, who is a global domain expert to deal with plastic pollution. And Siddharth can take us through about the INC and the plastic treaty and how CSE is positioning itself to deal with this problem and how CSE is going to engage with the Global South further. And then I will come back and conclude my presentation about how CSE has created a program or a forum to engage with the Global South to contribute and improve the solid waste management ecosystem. Over to you, Sid. The floor is now yours.
Thanks, Atin. Let me just share my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes, Siddharth, you can go ahead.
Okay. So basically, if we talk about plastics, plastics are a part of the overall solid waste that is generated in any continent or in any part of the world, right? So in most parts of the world, plastic is considered to be a part of the larger solid waste management domain. Now, if we just look at some numbers around the African continent, what we know today is Africa produces, because there's one bit of it's called plastic production. How much primary plastic is being produced in Africa? That number is somewhere around 4%, right? Africa consumes, which means Africa uses about 5% of all the plastics that are used across the globe. And we all know that with a population of around 1.3 billion across the continent, the contribution of Africa's population to the entire globe is around 16%, right? So 16% of the people across the globe making 4% of the plastic across the globe and consuming a mere 5% of it. However, what is concerning is that almost 80% of the plastic waste that is generated in the African region is mismanaged. Which means it either goes to dump sites, open dump sites, or unscientific landfills. It is either openly burned, or it may be leaking into some water body. It may be leaking into drains, into our water bodies, rivers, and potentially the ocean. Right? Now, there are, if you look at, what are our options to deal with plastic pollution, our options are not many, right? We are severely limited by the number of options that we have. One such option is to have a national legislation that is dedicated to plastic waste management, something that we here in India have been able to do in 2016. And that was probably for the first time that we had a dedicated law for dealing with plastic waste. Um, from whatever data we've been able to collect by interacting with the countries that we work with and the officials that we basically engage with, we have not found a single African nation that has a dedicated national legislation or law or rules that basically deal with the issue of plastic waste. Apart from that, the other strategy is a ban on single-use plastics. The good news is that Africa as a continent is actually leading in this front, right? So most of, I would not say most, but a considerable number of countries from the African continent, of the 54 countries that we have actually been able to ban single-use plastics. Now, the problem is that single-use plastics are defined differently in different parts of the world, right? So here, if we talk about India, we have identified 19 single-use plastic items that we found problematic. If we talk about Europe, they have identified around 10 problematic single-use plastic items and they have banned them. In Africa, most of the single-use plastic items or the single-use plastic item bans have revolved around carry bags, right? And there are certain East African countries that are leading the kind of the show in dealing with single-use plastic carrier bags. And then we have a third kind of a policy tool, which we call as extended producer responsibility, which is based on the principle of polluter pays, which means businesses and entities who are putting out plastic in the national market or in the regional market are held accountable to collect them back and send them for recycling. So last year we did a study. Our team at the Center for Science and Environment, we did a study where we basically studied the data that we have and the policies that we have in 15 African countries. Now you can see that we have covered some of the Western African countries like Ivory Coast, Ghana. We have a considerable number of Eastern African countries like Kenya, Tanzania, and we've also covered some in the southern part. Now, what we found is that the plastic waste generation is not really high for all the countries. Like the highest that we could find was in Nigeria, which was generating about 2.5 million tons of plastic waste every year. And Nigeria also happens to be like one of the biggest oil producers in the entire continent. The raw materials for making plastics are very cheap in this region. Similarly, for Ghana, we had around 1 million metric tons of plastic waste being produced. If you go to Eastern Africa, we have the highest producers are Tanzania, which produces about 1.21 million metric tons of plastic waste. Now, if you move or shift your focus now to the policies, we can see that apart from Ghana and Namibia, almost every country that we studied actually has a carry bag ban in place. The carry bag ban may be partial, which means that it is dictated by the thickness of the plastic bag, or it may be total, which means that irrespective of the thickness, whether it's a 50 micron or a 100 micron, carry bags are simply not allowed to be manufactured, used, and sold in these economies. And I would say that economies like Tanzania, Rwanda, and even Kenya are doing extremely well in implementing this ban, because having a policy is just kind of the start of the entire process. Actually implementing these policies is the actual ball game, right? And I think a lot of Eastern African countries have been able to very successfully achieve this. One thing that we found that is not very prominent in the African continent is extended producer responsibility. And we found that out of about 15 countries, we have about 7 countries that have a mention of the word extended producer responsibility uh, in their law or in their legislation, which are primarily dedicated to solid waste management and not particularly on plastic waste management. However, what we've seen in the last couple of years, since the agenda of plastic pollution actually became a global issue, we saw that Africa as a continent is leading from the front in areas, in negotiations where all the member states gather to discuss this issue. I will not spend a lot of time on challenges. In fact, I think this has been very well covered by Atin, and Richard has kind of touched base on all of these issues. So there is some amount of enforcement issue in most of the countries. There are no policies dedicated to plastic waste management. Data we've already talked about. There's very meager data around both waste management and particularly on plastics. There is lack of infrastructure funds. There is a need for capacity building in the entire continent. And there is lack of accountability, especially on the businesses who are basically putting these products on the market. Now, let me just quickly run you through this entire process that the world is now engaging in. This negotiations are happening between 175 member states, of which 54 are African. So Africa does, what Africa thinks, what Africa wants, really matters on this global stage, because almost 54 countries are represented by the African continent. So United Nations Environment Assembly, or UNIA as is commonly called, it was formed in 2012, about 11 years back. It was given a mandate to meet every 2 years, and its goal was to create an effective system of international environmental governance, which basically means we have to. This was a platform where all the environmental issues could be discussed, starting from pollution, biodiversity, the science around pollution, biodiversity, and also to some extent climate. What UNIA does is it defines the work of the United Nations Environment Program. Now, there have been a lot of deliberations. We know we are constantly saying that we are talking about ending plastic pollution, but the road was very long. It started in UNIA 1 in 2014, which means 9 years back. And every year, the member states decided that, okay, let us have plastic pollution on the agenda. But if you look at the rightmost column, you will find that the discussions have shifted from marine plastic or marine litter to now ending plastic pollution across the life cycle. So what basically emerged from the negotiations or the discussions that happened in these 5 UNIA meetings was that marine litter is an offshoot of a bigger problem, which we can refer to as plastic pollution. It is a material production issue. It is, a material consumption issue, and it also, to some extent, affects our human health. And that is how the narrative shifted from just talking about marine litter, which is a very small part of the entire larger problem of plastics, to talking about ending plastic pollution across the life cycle, which means we have to have reduction targets, reduction in primary plastic production. We need to change the way we are using plastics in today's times, and we also need to simultaneously
Siddharth, you are frozen.
Yes, I think, am I audible, Richard?
Yeah, you are audible. Siddharth is not.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, I think it's coming. Okay, Siddharth, you are on mute. You can hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm so sorry. There was some issue in the network.
Don't worry.
Can I just go back to my presenting my slide?
Yeah,
I think
please.
you have to share again.
Yes. Okay, sorry for but yeah, what I was sharing is that the decisions in this negotiating committee are solely made by governments. They are not made by United Nations. They're not made by civil society organizations or other, multilateral agencies. They are made by the member states, which means the government of these member states, 175 member states, are the only ones who are authorized to take decisions. Now, like I was saying, plastics is a material production issue. If you actually look at it from 1950, when we were producing about 2.5 million tons every year, we have actually catapulted to now produce about 460 million tons every year. And if you look at it, 1980s, early 1980s was the time when actually the exponential growth of plastic production started. And it is estimated that if we continue with business as usual, by 2060, this number will triple, right? So it is a material production issue. We are producing plastics at a much higher rate as compared to what we actually need. And probably this is the only material in the entire world which is driven not by its demand by consumers, but it is driven by the supply by the manufacturers. If you actually look at it, plastics is actually accelerating the triple planetary crisis of climate, biodiversity, and pollution. Right. So if I throw some numbers, about 1.8 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions is just because of production of plastics, which is about 3.5% of the overall global emissions. Petrochemical industry, which is kind of the place where plastics are made, they account for almost 10% of the global oil demand, right? So production of plastics is accelerating the climate crisis. It is also accelerating biodiversity loss. And it has been estimated that a 1% annual decline in marine ecosystems, which means even if we lose 1% of the corals, of the phytoplanktons that we have, that will translate to an economic loss of $500 billion across the global ecosystem. And then we definitely know that it is a pollution issue. We are dumping about 11 million tons of plastic every year into our oceans. Terrestrial leakage stands at around 31 million tons every year, and we are burning about 50 million tons of plastic every year, plastic waste every year. Now, what I also need to kind of highlight here is we've always been told that, we can recycle plastics. Plastics can be recycled, made into fresh products, which can be used and reused. But what's striking is that even in 2015, the global recycling rate for plastics was a mere 9%, right? We saw in the earlier slides as well, when we were looking at the Africa map, we saw that the highest recycling percentage that we had was not more than 10 to 12%, even for the African nations. In fact, there was a report which said that countries like United States of America, which claim to have very high level sophisticated technologies, are not recycling more than 5% of their plastic waste, right? And most of it is basically contributing to the pollution that we have. Now, recycling plastics cannot be looked at as the silver bullet or the solution or the excuse to continue to produce more and more plastics, because there are a lot of chemicals that go into production of plastics, and these are primarily used by the plastic industry itself. Which means that a petrochemical company manufacturing resins will provide resins to the plastic industry. Plastic industry prepares master batches depending on the demand from the brand owners. So what we have been able to find, not as CSE, but as the entire scientific community across the globe, we found that about 25,000 chemicals are used in the plastic industry. Of that, the United Nations Environment Program studied about 13,000 of them, and they found that a mere 128 chemicals of the 25,000 that are used by the industry are regulated, which means that the regulation percentage is about 0.5%. Only 0.5% of the chemicals are regulated that are used by the plastic industry. The remaining about 3,000, which means 24%, are believed to have potential human hazard, but are unregulated. About 6,000, there is no hazard data at all, which means that we don't know what will happen if they are subjected to heat, if the pH changes, if it enters into our oceans or other water bodies. And about 29% are chemicals of low concern, which have been identified that, okay, they do harm, but not to the extent that we really should be worried. But if you actually look at it, about 75% are of the plastics that of the chemicals that are used by the plastic industries are a concern to human health, which means even recycling these plastic materials means that we are also recycling these chemicals and putting it back on to the market and bringing it into our homes. And as we know, mostly in the global south, or rather all the recycling happens in the global south. The global north believes more in technologies like incineration, and what they cannot incinerate or what would prove to release toxic chemicals or gases after it is burnt is shipped to the global south, and here we do mechanical recycling. But these chemicals stay in our plastics even after they are recycled, right? So that is concerning. Now, there is a ray of hope for all of us. It's not all gloom and doom. We have this process going on, and we really do have a lot of high hopes from this process. Very recently, on the 4th of September, the INC Secretariat released the zero draft the for the negotiation process, and the zero draft is actually a very good document which covers a full range of issues, from reduction of primary production of plastics, eliminations of polymers of concern, something like a polyvinyl chloride, which is a halogenated plastic and has the potential to release very toxic gases like dioxins and furans, is also being talked about. Chemicals of concerns are being talked about. How do we eliminate and strengthen our list of single-use plastics is also talked about. Transparency, just transition, and there are also targets for reduce and reuse of plastic. So that is it from my side. I will now hand it back to Atin to discuss about the Global Forum of Cities for Circular Economy.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Siddharth. So I'll just wrap up within next 2 to 3 minutes. So we heard about this problem. Now CSE started working in the global south, since about 2015, 2016. But basically we've ramped up our engagement in the global south in 2021, when we found that the problems were way bigger, and small engagement with countries individually may not work as a matter of strategy. So we conceptualized a forum for cross-learning, for capacity building, for technical support, for exposure in 2021. And then we got initially 9 African nations joining the Global Forum of Cities for Circular Economy. We call it GFCC in short. So this is CSE's drive in the Global South to institute circular economy in the solid waste management space. In July 2022, we did the first 2 days event with this very senior representative of the 9 African nations. And we were basically deliberating on what the problems were and what they could do for a change. We did the second event in January this year in Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, where basically we found that the GFCC was gaining a lot of momentum with clear agenda for engagement and cooperation with extensive support from CSE. So they were basically looking at CSE as a conduit who could kind of pave the way so that the countries could collaborate with each other. We did the third GFCC event, and this was a kind of very different event in a sense that it was a comprehensive 5 days capacity building come exposure visit in India. So we brought, and in between we had 10 more nations joining, out of which 6 were African nations and 4 were Asian nations. I will talk about those countries in the next slide. So they joined GFCC understanding that mere fund or mere infrastructure cannot be of much use if we don't learn about the sustainable practices. We have had learnings from Tanzania, from Uganda, from Namibia, from Ghana, from Namibia, where big multilateral donors like African Development Bank, like the World Bank, they have invested millions of dollars in creating infrastructure. But if you go and check them now, they are barely being used. And even if they are being used, they are not really being used for the actual purpose they were meant for. So definitely GFCC is coming up with a lot of promises. This year in November, we are going to do the 4th GFCC in Accra, Ghana, in collaboration with the Environment Protection Agency, which is the national regulator in the government of Ghana, between 21st and 23rd of November, which is right after the 3rd INC meeting that Siddharth spoke about. Now you can see the member states in this slide. So we have 15 African nations, including, of course, Kenya. And then I would request my colleagues, Sukanya, Richard, and Sopon over there to at least share the two report, which is plastic waste management in Africa and solid waste management in Africa. This basically provides an overview of the magnitude of problem and the possible solutions that we can probably think of. Now, the good news is that GFCC now has a clear set of mandate to drive the change, which they are calling the agreed common action for agenda. So the waste quantification and characterization has to be mandated by the national regulation, and it has to be implemented well through a well-designed institutional arrangement. There's a concept of bulk waste generator in Indian policy, which these countries learned when they visited India in the month of May, and they also visited the Indian city of Pune, India, in the Indian state of Maharashtra, where apart from a very sustainable solid waste management ecosystem, they have also been exposed how informal sector have been integrated very successfully in the waste value chain, and they are basically having an agreement with the city government for doorstep collection of waste from 900,000 properties every day. So the second big mandate is separation of waste at source. It has to be non-negotiable. We have had enough failures worldwide to learn that unless separation of source happens, no technology, no solutions, no strategy, no plan can be successful. And we need to invest on wet processing and treatment. Now, we understand that it is difficult to change the system overnight. So we need to have a roadmap. We may start with a small area, maybe one municipal ward or two municipal ward. There are hundreds of examples where such approach has been adopted, and gradually those models have been scaled up as soon as the city government managed to secure more funding. We need to create an enabling environment for the PPP model or the public-private partnership model, which has worked brilliantly in many cities in India, where basically the private sector invested and created the infrastructure that was required for waste processing and treatment, which basically is an enabling mechanism to create a business ecosystem around solid waste. And like Richard has mentioned, that in Global South alone, the current business potential around waste management is worth $90 billion. The third agenda that the GFCC forum agreed that currently most of the waste management services in the Global South are outsourced, which means that the outsourced agencies are paid on the total quantity of waste collected. Here I mean to say the total quantity of mixed waste that is collected. Now here the terms and conditions are decided by the municipal government. So we need to redesign the concessional agreement or the contracts so that the outsourced agencies are paid on the basis of the source separated quantities of waste and not on the basis of mixed waste, which is just collected and dumped. And that is how basically you are losing the value of waste and we are creating more environmental challenges. Municipal bylaws are basically kind of an Indian policy space where by amending our constitutions, special power and authority have been delegated with the local government. And we have learned that this system also prevails in many Global South countries. And we have agreed that we will share these knowledges even with the policymakers so that they can bring these changes to use these local laws to good effect for sustainability. The fourth agenda is investing on the behavior change communication. We need to understand waste management is a shared responsibility. With technology alone, it is impossible to manage it until the waste generator themselves realize their responsibility. There has to be incentive, there has to be penal provision, but we need to build their capacity and we need to create mechanism to change their behavior so that they realize how important it is for their own survival to separate the waste, at least dry and wet waste, and hand it over to the collector. Optimizing the waste collection and transportation. This is where almost 70% of the money is being spent, or let me say money is being wasted, the collection and transportation. We are having an army of vehicles, an army of sanitation staff, and in return, we are almost getting nothing. Prioritizing decentralized approach. We have seen many good models, especially in Tanzania. We visited an area called Boniokwa, where we have found that a wonderful zero waste model is in place. A couple of municipal wards, they are separating their waste. It is being brought for composting.
The dry waste are being recovered and being sold to the recyclers. They're earning good money. So it is not absolutely essential to collect the entire waste of the city and take it 15-20 miles out of the city limit, burning a lot of fuel, wasting a lot of money, and just creating huge garbage mountain. Integration of informal sector is the sixth agenda. Global South probably couldn't have thought about anything other than how do they find ways to integrate the informal sector. When we had the representative from the GFCC in India in the month of May, they witnessed themselves a wonderful model. And after the visit, we had a big delegation from Ghana. It was from the Ministry of Environment and representative of the EPA, who basically came and discussed with the city government and found ways to replicate this model in many various cities in Ghana, including the Accra Metropolitan Assembly. Now, if I summarize the circularity concept, we need to do two major things. We need to incentivize source separation. At the same time, we need to disincentivize dumping practice. So to disincentivize, there are 2 or 3 things that we can do. We need to legally ban dumping of biodegradable and combustible waste like plastic. If you can imagine a dump site without these 2 fractions, your dump sites are far easier facilities to manage. Implement the polluters pay principle or the EPR policy, which Siddharth has already spoken. We need to implement that as well in the Global South. There are systems of landfill tax, because landfills are meant to receive only rejects, only the inerts which are non-reactive and non-hazardous. It is not meant to dump everything and anything. So these are the measures that the GFCC agreed to implement in their policy space to disincentivize the practice of dumping. And like in India, there is a legal mandate to close all the existing dump sites, which are basically uncontrolled dump site. There is no scientific containment, so everything was creating huge pollution. So if I refer the National Clean India Mission, please pardon me for the spelling mistake, it should be Clean India Mission 2.0, which is patronized by our Honorable Prime Minister. So the first mandate that it gives, it's between 2021 and 2026, is reclamation of land after complete biomining of the legacy dump site. This is basically the legacy mountains, the garbage mountains symbolizes the mismanagement of waste that we have been practicing for the last 30-40 years. And then it also mandates, the second big mandate, that you create infrastructure for processing and treatment considering your current and projected generation of waste. And then there's a third mandate, by the end of the mission in 2026, all the Indian cities should be able to divert at least 80% of the waste from reaching the dump site. So we have shared all the policy documents and our learnings with the GFCC. And when we meet in Ghana next month, we would probably deliberate more on that. So with this, I conclude my presentation and thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions, me and Siddharth can take them. Thank you. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Atin and Siddharth. Thank you very much for this presentation. And basically, this is in the morning, we heard about the miraculous things that human invented. And one after another, we have now busy dismantling that. But next month, I think in Nairobi, you will have that conference and we are going to, again, another treaty. So that's to sum it up. I think fantastic data and the way you have put it, it shows that it's not an easy journey at all. Another climate-like situation. Now we have time for questions. And so we have overshot the time. So any questions? I'm just, here is a question. Plastic to fuel as a solution. Is it a feasible one for Africa, or also in general, is it a solution at all?
Okay, so Atin, can I take this?
Yeah, please. I was about to say that. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I think, see, if you actually divide up recycling today, everything is termed as recycling, right? Even if you burn your waste in specialized incinerator facilities, it is still termed as recycling, which is not how it should work, right? So if you divide up recycling into 4 quadrants, you can divide it up into primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary, right? Which essentially means when I say primary recycling, I mean I recycle a bottle, a water bottle, and I am making a bottle out of it, right? In secondary recycling, I take a water bottle and I make something else out of it, maybe a t-shirt, right? Tertiary recycling is I take a piece of bottle and I make fuel out of it, which is also commonly now called as chemical recycling. Now, this is a technology that has been tried in a lot of places. In fact, even in Africa, we have seen some technologies. We've seen technologies in India. We've also seen technologies like these in the global north. The problem with this technology is we have not seen a single plant that has been able to scale this technology. We've seen 10-ton plant, 100-ton plant, but we just saw the numbers, right? We are producing 500 million tons of plastic waste. And if the scale cannot go beyond, let's say, 100 or 500 tons per day, which means this solution is seriously under consideration. It is actually being pushed by a lot of industry agencies. But the fuel that we get out of this. So one problem is scalability. The other problem is the quality of the fuel that you get out of such technologies. Presence of industries who can use these fuels around in the catchment area, right? So if you have to transport this fuel to, let's say, 500, 600, 700 kilometers or 700 miles away from where it is being produced, the cost also goes up. So these are some challenges. It can be done, but right now we do not have evidence of whether it can really be scaled up to a point where it actually makes a difference.
Thank you, Siddharth. Any questions? Yeah.
I know that whenever we're trying to look for recyclable energy and ways of making sure that we are taking care of our environment, not every solution is going to be 100%. So my question is, I know that in India and also I've seen some parts of Africa, we are trying to use plastic to make roads and to make better roads, which are better, and from studies they look to be stronger and more durable. So my question is, are there studies, or are you considering to do studies around these concrete that they are making, and also the covers that they are making out of plastic, to see their impact to the environment, and also these roads, which are very many kilometers, what are their impacts to the environment and also to climate change? Thank you.
So you got the question. Basically, using plastic waste for road building.
I think
Okay.
Atin can answer this. So Atin, the question basically is the use of plastic waste in road making is now prevalent in a lot of regions across the globe. So what are the advantages and disadvantages? If like that's kind of in a nutshell, that's
this is Sid, you can also chip in because you have also worked a lot on this area. So yeah, this is basically something that has been tried and it is still being pushed in India. The two reasons why roads are damaged is basically exposure to heat, sunlight, and exposure to massive rainfall, right? Basically, what plastic does when it is mixed with the bituminous and the stone chips, it creates a waterproofing layer, and that way it increases the life of the road, right? So in India, we have a Ministry of Road Transport and Highways, which basically governs construction and maintenance of the entire national highway length across the nation. But while you are melting plastic at a temperature between 150 to 200 degrees Celsius, which is absolutely not recommended. Basically, that is the temperature that they use to melt plastic and create a bituminous mix before the road is made. So if that, I mean, when basically it is being pushed, we are basically not really talking about the environmental footprint of it. But in terms of technology, whether it is beneficial, the answer is a straight yes. It can, I mean, the examples that we have, wherever it has been tried, whatever it has been put in practice, now it is almost a policy in government of India that at least, there has to be a 5 to 10% of plastic usage. And as we have learned that at least 1 ton of plastic can be used to construct at least a kilometer of a road, right? It is being still pushed, but like I said, when you are burning plastic at such a low temperature, you are creating a huge environmental footprint. So as a solution, it can work if the cost that we are paying for the environment is okay. Sid, if you have anything quick point to kind of add, you can.
So yeah, I would just want to kind of recall the slides on the chemicals, right? We are using 25,000 chemicals in our plastics. The plastic industry uses that. On an average, any product you take that is made out of plastic will have anything between 20 to 25 different chemicals, right? 60% or rather 70% of which is not known. About 25% is known to have some kind of human health impact. So while there is economic benefit, the road will, serve a longer mean service life. But we also need to consider the human health part of it in terms of what kind of emissions will happen when all these plastic products go at a temperature range where full combustion is not happening, or it is basically being melted and not really burned. So that is one a part of the argument that we have. The other part that I would like to kind of submit in front of this group is most of these pilots, whenever they are done at lab scales, right? So whenever the bitumen uh, uh, or the plastic creating a layer over the bitumen is done, it's done at lab scale with cleaner plastics. Now, when we talk about municipal solid waste and plastics that are present in municipal solid waste, we do not really get those lab conditions with the plastic that we procure for road making. So that is another operational level challenge that a lot of contractors that we have interacted with are facing, at least in India. So yeah, that's pretty much the entire bandwidth of what we know. It is good for economic reasons, but if you also consider human health reasons, there's not enough research to kind of arrive at this conclusion whether or not we should go ahead.
Thank you, Siddharth. Any other questions? We have overshot the time and have to. So just to conclude. I think this is a session that very much, I think we migrated from waste to plastic, the most challenging element we invented. And for every solution, there is also a problem with it. Fundamentally, it's a problem. I think we need to eliminate it. It's just like your green gas houses. Gases. That to a certain level, it's fine. But in case of plastic, it seems that there is nothing called a limit or permissible limit or anything. As recent studies are also showing that we are breathing almost plastic now. So every day, every month, you will find scientists are finding the remains of plastic in our body organs or things. The latest one says that we are actually breathing few plastics. So just to conclude this, thank you very much. And Siddharth and Atin, thank you for taking out time for joining us and giving this. The PPT is being shared, and if you have more questions and clarifications, we'll be in touch with you for answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, 15 minutes? That's what, 15 minutes for break? 15 minutes, we can come back, the tea is being served at the back.